Welcome everyone. My name's Amanda Scott. I'm the Program Manager of the Farming Together program, and Simone here is the workshop facilitator for this evening and a fabulous team member from the program as well. We're really excited to have the first of a series of 7 webinars for you starting tonight on collaborative solutions for farmers, fishers and foresters. And we want to provide the opportunity for you to hear the stories about farmers from farmers themselves. For those of you who don't know about the Farming Together program, we've been running since 2016, and in that time we've helped 30,000 farmers, fishers and foresters from across 23 different industries to implement their collaborative solutions. Our guests tonight, Birchip Cropping and Sounness, we have worked with for a number of years now, and Chris was actually one of the IAG members on the Farming Together program. All right, so tonight's topic is Dare to Share Your Data, and I think it's a really important and hot topic at the moment. I think we've had a lot of interest in this webinar series, which has been fantastic. Particularly, we want to hear about the data sharing concept from farmer and farmer groups who've actually tried to implement that concept themselves, talking about, particularly I think about finding shared value in data sharing and all the tribulations and triumphs with going through trying to establish that data cooperative. As I said, we've got 2 amazing guests tonight I would like to introduce. The first one is Phillip Guthrie, who's Birchip Cropping Group's innovation portfolio, developing and managing projects that help Birchip members and Australian broadacre farmers increase their productivity, profitability and sustainability. So welcome, Phil. And our second speaker is Sounness. Formerly of Birchip Cropping Group, Chris is the Executive Director at Wimmera Development Association. During his time with Birchip, Chris facilitated 40 farmers to connect their weather station data so that it was uploaded to a single shared source. So welcome to you both. We're really looking forward to your presentation, and I'll hand over to you now.
No worries. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me back. And I think I'm going first, and Phillip is actually going to talk about the hard work, but I'm going to talk about the early experience around data sharing. I'll sort of take you on the journey. I might rush through it a bit, but that's because I think Phillip will actually give you far more truth than I present, and mine's going to be a very Panglossian view of the world. But let's get underway. Can you see the screen? Everyone can see the screen? All good?
Great, Chris. Yeah.
Yep. All right. So I started looking at data co-op when I first joined Birchip Cropping Group. It was about 2014, and I could see there was a lot of interest in farmer data, but whenever you tried to actually find any decent sets of it, there wasn't anything anywhere. It was uncurated source. So I suppose someone that likes a lot of order and really very much about process, and those 2 statements, if you know me at all, will be absolute lies. It's not the way I think at all. But I could see there was a real effort. There was a real reward if there was curated data sets. Doing the boring stuff, the librarian sort of task, because actually whenever you try and find information, it was all over the shop. And that was probably where I started my journey around this data co-op space along the way. I picked up a few people who were like-minded, and Phillip's one of them, and yeah, we've had the opportunity to work together. So that's why Phillip gets to tell the story, because I moved on from Birchip Cropping Group to Wimmera Development Association, but reality is this should all be labelled BCG. So I suppose the piece we looked at was a data ag co-op, and the question we kept on coming up to was it a solution or was it just amplifying problems? So what's the opportunity? Phillip and I did some work with a couple of other partners, and we came up and got an economist involved that there was potentially up to $120 a hectare available in farm data. So that sounds pretty exciting. And a lot of that was available to the farmer in an ideal, perfect world. When you think of a value chain, that $120 a hectare, and most regions are millions of hectares in size, you start getting huge, scary numbers, and you think it's great, and there's lots of money available to the farmers. But when you start having conversations about the farmers with this, you sort of go to this world here. And and that's basically the response every farmer gives you then and still today around data. They think it's great, but yeah, they don't believe any of the things. So what are some of the costs involved or the rewards available? We know there's some work we did was around the cost of poor mobile coverage. We've identified some challenges there, so that's part of the opportunity. So there was a connectivity piece. We identified there was a capability piece also. And this is the way I'd sort of frame it, is if any farmer came to me and said, I have $100,000 to invest because they want to get the benefits of digital agriculture, and this was the question I was asking in 2016 or 2017, I think this question still is prevailing today, who would you recommend they talk to so they get the best bang for their back for the $100,000, so it isn't just a sort of buying the bright shiny thing, but sets them up foundationally for a 10 or 20 year digital agricultural strategy? And I looked around and I actually found there was very limited capability in this space of who could actually help farmers set up a digital strategy, on-farm digital strategy, which I think is a real shame for our industry that we haven't developed this capability to be able to help farmers realise the opportunity. So I think it's not just a farmer challenge, it's a whole industry challenge. And I was always thinking, what role does grower groups have in this place? And then we've got the trust issues. And back in 2016, 2017, when I was really diving into this space around trust, there was a lot of discussions about it. I suppose since then, probably things have got even more challenging. There's probably even greater mistrust between various players. But in the end, we've got to be able to, for these type of institutions that are data co-op to work, we identified you need sort of ethical regulatory issues. You need to understand around ownership, and that ownership of data is an interesting statement because the reality is you can't actually own data, but it's a concept people can understand, except when it comes to legality, when data doesn't actually have any legal standing. You've got to be able to offer security and trust, and I think there's a lot more awareness around that in the industry now. And you've got to have a business model that's actually where it's viable, and that's possibly the biggest challenge I faced while I was at BCG, trying to strike that business model. And that was the support we had from Farming Together, and we'll touch on that shortly. So what are the barriers? There was a lack of standards. They're still here today. Lack of leadership, and Phillip, I'm sure, will touch on that during his presentation. If he doesn't, he's sillier than he looks. The technology always promises more than it delivers. And the business case or the value proposition isn't necessarily clear. And that was the bit that we started with, and that's the bit that Philip's been working on. And I think he's getting close to cracking it, because it's very hard when you've got a blank sheet of paper to convince someone there's a business case. You haven't got any benchmarks to go off. And that was the bit I think Philip's been working really hard on, and he's trying to create the business case. And it's very hard to create a business case when there's no other model you can compare it to. So what was the data co-op? We put the concept to the Farming Together program. We were trying to start a business to, I suppose, develop a business and sort of understand what legal protections are needed and some of the technical challenges. And technical challenges can always be overcome, and I think we got to the point where we know we can overcome them. It's just the business model that's going to fund the way to overcome them, and I'm sure Phillip will be touching on that shortly. We sort of want to try and develop a data co-op, have 50 growers, and we want to be able to collect machine data sets from harvesters and tractors. And this machine data sets coming from harvesters and tractors is fairly old school. It's not new technology, but as we did with one trial with CSIRO, trying to get those data sets off the farmers was absolutely huge challenge, and it's very hard to actually get curated data sets. So what's a data co-op? It's a data co-op enables farmers to collectively manage how value from their data is created and shares, a mechanism to actively engage with other participants and build value across the agricultural industry. And I suppose we also identified what you need for a market. You need what the farmers need, what the service providers need, what the users need, what the market operators need, and what everyone clearly needs jointly. And all this work was work that the data co-op funding helped support. So I suppose while I was at BCG, we did a lot of the theory, and I'm going to flick through a couple of slides quickly because I don't want to talk for too long, or I might want to talk for too long, but I realise Phillip will realise I'm eating into his time. But we did a lot of the theory, but I suppose through the program, we didn't actually get to the point of the viable business model. And the last thing we wanted to launch was a business that was just a whim and didn't have a sustainable way forward, because that would actually put the whole thing backwards. So we were always wanting to make sure it was a sustainable business if we were going to make it live. So we invested a lot of time in understanding from a whole range of different points of view around what the value proposition is. We also went through what the mission is, sort of why. We did a lot of work with CSIRO trying to actually, I suppose, get the theory right. And as I say, why, when you've got a blank sheet of paper, having an understanding of that theory becomes very important. It's not necessarily, once again, it's a bit like a data cop in the first place. It's not very sexy stuff. It's a lot of, I suppose, social science work, which isn't everyone's cup of tea, but in the end, it's actually going to be very valuable in going forward, because it actually can work out where the weaknesses and challenges and opportunities are and what people's behaviours will be. And I think some of this information has been very valuable going forward. And what the benefits are, where that can be delivered, and how it's stored. So, as I say, we did a lot of the theory and a lot of the hard work, created all the potential players, mapped out the whole thing. So really the business case is sort of coming together, but once again, the business model was the challenge. We saw even this barriers piece, we kept on going back to that. What are the motivations? What is the ability? And they're reasonably big barriers. And I might just about leave it there, but so the value proposition is, as I say, we want to enable valuable insights from farmer data, and the implications are pretty, as I say, you can read them there now, but that's enabling farmers to share their data, but they have ability to control how it's shared, and they get valuable insight also, but the benefits can be wider than just the farmers. But the challenge is, once you share data once, how do you make sure that value isn't lost? And that's the challenge. That's why Google and everything like that are quite happy to give you Google Maps, because, as I say, you share your position once, but they get a lot of insight from that, which they continually resell. So yeah, that's probably where I'll leave it there. I'll just put this last slide up because it's a nice, as I say, there's a lot of this is all a theory, but that's how you actually turn it into a hard piece of work. And I think that's the piece that Phillip's going to take you through now, is making it real. So I suppose, as is always my whim, it was all about the theory and what could potentially happen, but other people actually got to have the fun job of trying to make it happen. And Phillip, I'll leave it with that handball. I'll leave it to you, or as a rugby pass in your language, leave it to you to actually make it happen, because, as I say, I had my 5 years at Birchip. I could see the value in it. All the people in the industry could see the value in it. Even the farmers could see the value in it. But there was just no way to actually provide an incentive enough to change behaviours from everyone concerned to actually make it worthwhile, either financially or behaviourally or whatever. And around changing behaviours, we all know the incentive's got to outweigh the pain. So thank you. Phillip, over to you to turn it into the real world.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. If anyone does have any brief questions now, Chrissy, happy to answer a couple now if anyone has any. I haven't got any in the chat. Otherwise, we can come back after Phillip's presented and he might answer some of your questions that you're thinking of now. Okay, wonderful. Thanks again, Chris. That was excellent. And no doubt we'll have some questions at the end as well. And are you there, Phillip? Olivia's just putting there, Chris, what type of data is being collected?
I reckon I'll, as I say, it's generally farmers involved in broadacre agriculture, so the data sets were from what the tractors are collecting automatically, what the harvesters are collecting on automatically, such as yield and quality, and weather data from, we encourage a number of farmers to buy weather stations, and we work closely through this weather station concept of trying to educate and encourage farmers to think about, would they share the data? Why were they sharing it with others? Because if they bought the equipment outright, what was their view? Were they happy for their neighbour to see it? Were they happy for other members of the group who were sharing to see it? Were they happy for everyone to see it? And we're just trying to use weather data, which in theory everyone values, but actually probably has very little market value because there's so many different ways of getting it, to get them to think through some of the challenges around data sharing. So it was we use weather data as an educational discussion point.
Thanks, Chris. Did you set up groups of like cropping farmers to establish benchmarks?
I reckon that's best Phillip's touching, because as I say, I went through the theory and we talked a lot with other grower groups, but once again, we just couldn't, in the time while I was at Birchip Cropping Group and through the life of the project, we just couldn't get the business model over the line, because I think mainly it was the technical challenges. And I know Phillip will be talking about that, so I think Phillip will be best to be able to answer that.
Okay, thanks.
I think just to preface the presentation, the benchmarking side of things is absolutely critical. But what we're trying to do at the moment is establish what we're benchmarking, and what we're benchmarking from both the farmer's perspective and from the industry perspective, because we're caught in this loop at the moment where unless we can get industry investment, we're unable to demonstrate value to farmers through benchmarking. But without the data from farmers, we're unable to create the benchmarks in the first place. So that's the loop we're trying to shortcut, and that's the loop we've kind of been stuck in for the last 4 years and getting closer to resolving. But all of the discussions we're having at the moment with the various CRCs and the RDCs, it's benchmarking farmers on a variety of aspects, production-wise, efficiency-wise, and obviously with what's coming down the pathway at the moment and the funding available, their ability to manage drought and recover from drought is an absolute crucial one. I'll just pull up my preso. If I can find it. For some reason, it's not popping up in my share list. There we go. Okay, so first, just as an introduction for those that don't know BCG or Birchip Cropping Group, we're a farming systems group based in northwestern Victoria, centred around Birchip, so the Southern Mallee. Our membership covers the Wimmera Southern Mallee region, so cropping country, kind of extending from the South Australian border up to the Murray River and down to about Ballarat, Bendigo, a fairly large chunk of territory. We have 400 farms as members and 700 individual members within those farms, so multiple generations within family farms. And our farms cover about 1 million hectares of the northwest. Our farmers are predominantly mixed livestock, mixed farming, so grains only or grains and livestock on their properties. I don't think we've all heard the hype over the last couple of years about the potential for ag tech, the value of ag data, how much it's worth, the difference it can make to the industry and what we can do with it. Figure of 20.3 has been banged around by AFI since about 2017 through precision to decision. There's discussions, again, around benchmarking and the value of benchmarking, so not only being able to learn from your neighbours and those in similar regions to you, but being able to learn from those in similar conditions across the country. So similar agroecological zones, whether they're in New South Wales, Southern Queensland, Victoria, South Australia or WA. Lift the capability of researchers, so being able to provide access to large quantities of high quality data to boost the amount of research. And I don't think we can underestimate the amount of duplication in data space and the cost that researchers are going to collect data for their research projects. We're working with one major university at the moment that last year spent $12,000 to install 3 soil moisture probes to get 3 sets of soil moisture data from 3 paddocks. And what we're talking about is the opportunity to open up tens of thousands of sets of soil moisture data. Now that university has its data set. Other universities have their data sets, and they tend to treat those data sets like they're their own intellectual property and don't necessarily share them with each other. So that the capability of what we can do by opening that data up in the RD&E space is phenomenal. And again, reducing those silos is absolutely critical. And that's the discussion at the moment, is that we have the potential to lead the world, unlock billions of dollars of value across the sector. And that's a big if, we can gain access to farm data. And it's this notion of Facebook for agriculture. Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Tesla, which isn't really a car company. Tesla is a data and machine learning company that just happens to use that data to drive vehicles autonomously in some cases. These are industries that didn't exist 20 years ago. And this is data that's been created that a lot of us didn't even anticipate we could use 20 years ago. And just to reiterate, AFI Precision to Decision Australian Farm Institute is the big document at the moment. This notion that unconstrained digital agriculture will deliver dollars to producers and dollars to the Australian economy. And the expectations of people who deal with in the industry, farmers are just going to throw the money at them. You go to Evoke Ag and there's new companies talking about their technology and how fantastic it is, and why farmers should be getting into it and what they can do with it. Obviously farmers are purchasing this stuff left, right and centre and installing these technologies on their farms, and the flow of data has started. Unfortunately, no. That's not the case. And a good analogue of why that's not the case is the use of precision agriculture in Australia. So this is a study that was done by Terry Griffin, who BCG brought to Australia in 2017 as part of a Vesky Fellowship. And he set up a number of surveys and some Twitter work around this. And what he found is this was the adoption of precision agriculture across Australia. So obviously, very promising that 85% of farmers are using yield monitors, huge adoption of GPS, auto steer, section control, and a very high adoption of various tools like yield profit or sensor spraying, weed mapping, protein monitors, and auto drafting for livestock. But the problem is that's where your data comes from that we use and potentially is going to unlock that $20.3 billion worth of value. So soil sampling, imagery, NDVI, ground truthing of imagery, NDVI, your weather stations for soil probes, etc., and even your VR are there. And the challenge with the yield monitors, even though we have 85% penetration, is when we surveyed our growers, we had 80 farmers turn up to a series of PA workshops and ask them about their use of yield monitors. Only 1 out of 9 farmers is calibrating their yield monitor. So out of that 85% of farmers that are using it, less than 10% are calibrating them. And what you end up with is a margin of error of about plus or minus 40%, which a farmer can work with. They just need to know whether that paddock yielded well or not, where it yielded well, and some rough estimate. But you take data with a margin of error of plus or minus 40%, throw it into research, particularly machine learning, and you're going to have some really interesting stuff come out the other end, which probably isn't going to reflect the reality we'll be much used to anyone at all. As part of those workshops, we also surveyed our farmers about where both precision agriculture and ag tech, ag data sat on the Gartner hype cycle. So that the hype cycle is this adoption curve, basically, of how products are developed and how they're perceived. You start off with the technology being developed, it goes to a peak of hype, or what's called the peak of inflated expectations, where everyone's very excited about what it can do. And then there's a staggering realization that it's been overhyped, oversold, and can't actually do much of what people said it would anyway. And you end up in the trough of disillusionment. And that's where you get your amalgamation of companies, products and services being brought together, and the real work starting. And you start to climb up through what they call the slope of enlightenment to the plateau of productivity, which is where it's actually working, delivering value, and people are starting to use it. And as we surveyed our growers, we found two things. So looking at precision agriculture, we were sitting about there. There was real value being demonstrated from PA technologies. A lot of growers were starting to use it, and we hope to see adoption of those technologies that are delivering data increase over the next couple of years. And certainly the Gartner hype cycle would indicate that that's happening, and we're about to see that happen. Where we started to talk about agricultural data and agricultural technology, that's where our farmers put it. So yes, the PA was demonstrating value, but the data they were collecting from their PA machinery, they didn't really know how to use. Their service providers, their agronomists for a lot of cases didn't know how to use it. The people that sold them the machinery didn't know how to use it. And as a consequence, they weren't getting any value out of it. And what there was this massive mismatch between what they were seeing in the marketplace, what they were hearing, and what they were actually experiencing. So the good news is we will hopefully see some value out of it at some stage. The bad news is it seems like we've got a bit more pain to go through before farmers are really clear on that value and prepared and willing to adopt. The other thing to notice, when we talk about data, and as I mentioned before, Facebook, Amazon, not Microsoft, Tesla, all making absolute use of data, making millions, billions, trillions of dollars out of data. It pays to remind ourselves that farming is a very different industry. As Kennedy once said, a farmer is the only person in the economy who buys at retail, sells at wholesale, and pays the freight both ways. That means two things for a farmer. One, they are very conscious of cost. They are very conscious of the need for technologies to pay their way. They are very risk averse when it comes to adapting new technologies that don't have a clear value case. And two, it reminds us very clearly that unlike Facebook and a lot of these organisations, the data we're trying to access is privately held in a similar way. But those companies all had a very clear value proposition for us to share our data with them. We have some issues with Facebook around privacy and trust. But a lot of us continue to use it because the convenience of staying in touch with people is there, the ability to shop through Facebook is there. There's a really clear value proposition for us. There are some really significant barriers, as Chris alluded to realising the potential of data. And the perceived risk versus reward isn't really balanced at the moment, and it doesn't encourage farmer data sharing. So on the value front, farmers perceive little value to be gained from sharing data. That's something that continues in all the work we're doing, the discussions we're having, the workshops we're running, coming up again and again and again. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So the value for farm data use is poorly articulated. Give us your data. Why? Well, we can do something with it that's going to make you money. How? One of the things we see a lot is ag tech providers coming along and giving us presentations on what they can do and how much money they can make farmers and how great they can how much decision support they can offer. Out of the probably 30 or 40 companies I've dealt with in the last 12 months, they've had some pretty good stuff. What they haven't had is when I've said, okay, give me a farmer, give me a contact, show me a case study of how you've done this and who farmers have used it and let me talk to them. I've not had one come back to me today. So that's an indication of kind of the hype and the promise versus the reality. Farmers take all the risk in this space. They invest in the technologies, they invest in the data collection, they share that data. And for the most part at the moment, they're either not or poorly compensated for the cost associated with the data collection and the risk taking. So again, the value is not there. Poor RDC engagement with levy payers. I don't have to go out on a limb and say this because there was a report that came out and stated this at the end of last year. Means that the utility of research developed from that data may not necessarily be apparent to farmers. So they're providing their data, it's going into the RDC, it's going through a 5, 10, 15-year research cycle, and it's coming out the end, and they can't apply it anyway. So what was the point? The value created along the value chain quite often doesn't flow back to farmers. Quite often doesn't flow back to farmers. More often than not, it doesn't seem to flow back to farmers at all. We have this discussion at the moment about traceability and how it's going to create market access and protect market access, which is great until you realise that the amount of value being created by the value chain is massive, but that's not going back to the farmer at all. And despite significant costs, products and services fail to deliver against needs and expectations. Ag tech at the moment seems to be a solution in search of a problem. Someone's had a great idea, they've developed a product, they've launched the product, a farmer looks at it and goes, I don't need that. Or I can already do that at no cost. I don't need to pay $14 a hectare to get a slightly better version of what I've already got. And the conversation I have with a lot of ag tech companies is farmers make decisions based on practical wisdom. 10, 20, 30, 40 years of working the same paddock over and over and over again. They know how it operates. They can walk out into that paddock. They can show you the soil zones and where they change. They can show you the high-yielding parts. They can show you the low-yielding parts. They can talk you through why it's low-yielding. They can talk you through where the frost damage is coming from. And in some cases, going to a farmer and saying, look, you're making poor decisions. You need our product. Gets their back up because it's an absolute insult to their business and their knowledge of their business and how they operate. On the flip side, farmers perceive significant risks in sharing their data. So there's apprehensions regarding privacy and intellectual property, concerns about loss of data, sovereignty, and the ability to access their own data and use it. So we've already had cases of agronomists who have collected data from farmers who have then sold their company or their practice to a larger organisation. And the farmer's gone back to them and said, well, actually, I don't want to go across to company X. I'd like all my data for that back. Thank you very much. Only to find out that they signed a contract that says the agronomist owns their data and it's not actually their property anymore. That's happened in Birchip to a local farmer. It's happened in a number of other places. There's a very real fear of data misuse. So a company gathering data for one purpose, then either on-selling it or using it for another. Again, a very real case of companies coming to farming systems groups and asking for forecasts of the yield to be able to improve logistics, to then use those yield forecasts to cut prices, contract prices, and the prices being offered to farmers in advance of harvest. They do that once and then they don't get a look in again. And I think the point here is that there's also potentially temptation to take a regulatory approach. To force farmers to hand their data over for biosecurity or traceability reasons. The NLIS, National Livestock Identification System, offers a real lesson of how that operates. Now, the NLIS is a fantastic thing. It does protect market access. It provides a lot of biosecurity protections to Australia. The NLIS has been around since the mid-60s, and it's only now that it's starting to gain traction and the data that's flowing from it is starting to be used in a way that's meaningful on farm. And a lot of that is because farmers were forced to hand that data over and they resented it, and it took a lot of time to overcome that concern and mistrust. This notion that farming is a risky business and farmers are very tightly guarding their purse strings and very cautious of the investments they make, including ag tech. So this is an ABARES graph out of the most recent series of ABARES reports on the effects of drought and climate variability on Australian farms. And what you're seeing charted there is farm profit versus pricing in the international markets and rainfall. And you can see it's, obviously very variable. Half of the years there are negative returns or drops in profitability for farmers. What's also interesting is just because you've got good rainfall doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be profitable, and just because you've got good market prices doesn't mean you're going to be profitable. So again, that value proposition needs to be very clear. It needs to in some way start to mitigate some of these risks rather than add to them. This other notion of mistrust, this is Canadian data, but the Australian situation is very similar. So what we're looking at here is the GVP of the Canadian agriculture sector since 1926 through to 2016. The blue line is the gross value of production. The green line is the net farm income. That big blue thing in the middle is farmer expenses, or how much of what a farmer makes goes to someone else. So you can see that that gap has been growing, and that net farm income has in real terms remained reasonably stagnant, or actually even dropped. And there's a number of years there where it's actually gone negative, thanks to Adrian Rolls, who I believe is watching this for this slide. There are two things about this that really concern me, and that's that. The first is the two big revolutions in farming. The first is the mechanical revolution, so tractors, combine harvesters, not using horsepower, literal horsepower to move machinery anymore. The second is the green revolution, so the introduction of farm chemical and fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides. Those are huge things for the industry. They massively increase productivity on the farm. They massively lowered the cost of food for all of us and the availability of food for all of us. But clearly what they didn't do was make farmers more profitable. What they actually tended to do was, by the looks of things, open up the gap between what the industry was worth and what farmers were getting. And what frightens me and a lot of farmers is we're currently staring down the barrel of the third revolution in farming, which is the digital revolution. And we cannot afford to let that gap grow any further. We need to ensure that farmers are sharing, not necessarily taking all of the profit, but even if those gaps stay the same, that the net farm income is growing at the same rate. The second thing around that is farmers' share of the food dollar has fallen as well. So the share of retail food items, in this case a loaf of bread, has decreased and continues to decrease. So again, someone's making money out of these products, someone's making money along the way, but it's not the farmer. From the AFI Precision to Decision publication report, we switch across and we start to look at farmer trust of the organisations they're working with. So 56% of farmers have no to very little trust in the organisations to maintain or care for their data. 25% have some trust, and less than 20% have a high level of total trust in organisations to use their data appropriately. So when you take those things, that absolute lack of value, seeing someone else take your product or your data and making money out of it, and the fact that you don't trust them to use that data appropriately in the first place, we've got a massive problem that we need to resolve. The way we think we should be doing it, and as Chris outlined, is through a farmer-owned and operated agricultural data marketplace. So providing a secure, trusted mechanism to share agricultural data that's owned by farmers and operated on their behalf, that provides them with a clear value proposition, that provides a secure repository to manage and share their data, or not share their data if they choose not to, and ensures farmers sovereignty over that data. So they can share it, they know who they're sharing it, why they're sharing it, what they're getting for it, and that they can have some sense of confidence that it's not going to be misused or unsold. We've been working on 4 project streams. This is kind of where it starts to evolve from where Chris was talking. The first of these is around developing a value case for data collection and use. So we are looking at what we're calling digital agronomists, which is a kind of a combination between data scientists and agronomists. An agronomist who understands where the data is coming from and how it can be used, can help the farmers collate, clean and interpret their data, to help them develop PA plans to exploit areas of value identified from the data, to identify and develop clear value cases and economic modelling to support data use, and also to act as a bridge between farmers, researchers, product developers, startups working on research, development, extension, adoption and commercialisation projects, which is how the federal government is now terming what we do. Really, that's just shorthand for ensuring that the researchers understand the needs that farmers are trying to solve, and the research at the end of the day actually delivers what it says it's going to do, so that we close that loop and show farmers that sharing your data has value to you in an on-farm sense, because it helps you make money, improve your profitability, more likely reduce your cost of operation, but it also has some indirect benefits through better problem solving, better research, better product development. We're looking at recruiting 3 digital agronomists as part of this, so 1 in New South Wales, 1 in Victoria, and 1 in WA. And we're working closely with a number of partners and some state government partners to get those digital agronomists up and running. The second is around implementing a farm data repository. So if we're collecting data, we need to store it somewhere. We need to have a mechanism so where farmers are storing it, it can be accessed, utilised and shared. The main way we're looking at doing this the repository concept is well understood. There are data lakes all over the place. We have Agriculture Victoria with a rather sizable one for its IoT project. We've got Telstra with a fairly sizable data project as well. So how do we adapt those products? How do we customise those products so we can protect our farmers' data? And what we're looking at doing as part of this is developing an integrated sandbox, which is a bolt-on that sits on the back of the data repository. And the analytics occur within that controlled environment. So there is no opportunity to export that raw data. You export the results of the analytics, or you gain the results of the analytics. And it also provides us with a clear audit trail of who's accessed the data, how it was used, what it was used for, to ensure, and again, ring alarm bells if something's not being used correctly. The third thing we're investigating as part of this is federated learning. The patterns, not the data, are shared. It's a rather vague statement. But in essence, what it means is the data is retained locally, so it sits on an on-farm server or the farmer's cloud with their farm management software, and the algorithms actually reach out, do the processing locally on farm, bring the results of that back rather than the data itself. So again, it's just another way of ensuring our members and potential cooperative members that their data cannot be misused or cloned. A large part of last year was working with a range of partners to develop that, which is an information architecture for the data cooperative and the structures for how it's going to work. We developed this with some assistance from Agriculture Victoria, and then validated it with Dell, IBM, Microsoft, Amazon Web Services, and one interesting occasion took it into Telstra to show them and say, hey, we think we've got something here, we'd be interested in talking to you about building it. To have most of the people in the room rotate their heads 90 degrees to the left and either laugh or look really horrified, because Telstra had just spent about $12 million building exactly that. And if you rotate our information architecture 90 degrees to the left, it looks pretty damn similar to theirs. So we were very happy about that because we no longer have to find $12 million to build that. We just need to customise what Telstra's already built to be able to move forward. The third, we're collecting the data, we're storing it somewhere. We need rules around how we use it. We need rules around how the cooperative operates. Recent research with BCG members around their ability and interest in taking part in the cooperative is positive. 75% of our members are keen to be involved in the cooperative. 25% vehemently opposed to it. The vehement opposition comes from the fact that they've been burned from cooperatives before, and the reason they've been burned is you have one of two things potentially happen. The large farmers dominate the cooperative and the small farmers feel left out, or the small farmers dominate the cooperative and the large farmers who are in essence paying for it feel like they're not getting value for money. So we need to do some significant work around governance to ensure that that doesn't occur, that everyone is represented, and identify a model that works for all. One of the partners in this is the Business Council of Co-ops and Mutuals, who are providing some in-kind assistance to look at the governance structures. BCCM is the peak body for co-ops in Australia. So they have a significant amount of experience in this space, and through their CEO, Melina Morrison, have been on board right from the start. So big thanks to BCCM. Also looking at the legal frameworks, contracts, intellectual property protections, data sharing agreements, again, the boring stuff that holds everything together, and the development of business models, so data sales, direct value transfer in terms of potential shareholdings in startups or royalties from researcher products and services, and indirect value transfer, which is products and services that farmers can use themselves. So legal frameworks, Griffith University, Leanne Wiseman, who would be one of the kind of most acknowledged people in the agricultural IP space, is partnering with us on this. And the business models is DPIR, the Department of Primary Industries in WA, and FarmLink, GGA, the Grower Group Alliance, which is an aggregation of about 70 WA grower groups. The fourth sub-project, and I acknowledge this is complex, and I'll anticipate that question. There's a lot of moving parts, Phillip. This is a complex problem. Yes, it's an incredibly complex problem that requires a fairly complex solution. The thing for us is to kind of mitigate those moving parts and identify the right people with the right skills to be able to work on each of them. The fourth part of this is the research, product and service development. So the digital agronomists working with the farmers and the researchers, again, to identify the problems. RD&E projects being spun up and funded through traditional CRC and RD3 pathways. We're talking to Food Agility CRC and the proposed Smarter Regions CRC, GRDC and MLA, all very keen to get their hands on the data that comes out of this, and all very keen to be spinning up research projects. And looking at data marketed to potential private sector partners, so your input providers, your banks, your insurance companies, on the caveat again that those have clear benefits to farmers and a clear use for farmers. So one of the options being discussed at the moment for future drought fund potentially is benchmarking, looking at identifying elements of risk within farmers, how they address that risk, and then working with insurance companies and banks and others to reward those farmers who are managing that risk better or have practices in place that allow them to mitigate some of that risk. My initial thoughts around this, that farmers would be quite opposed to that. What we're finding is that the farmers who have the data are also the farmers who are feeling a bit screwed over, because they're the ones who aren't able to get multi-peril crop insurance at a great rate, because they're being penalised by what they see as farmers with riskier practices. So we're getting a lot more traction with that than we anticipated. And I think it's important to note again that we're starting in grains, because that's where we operate, and that's where Chris was when he had the initial concept around this. But there is significant potential for this to move into other ag sectors. Livestock is a key one for us, and there's opportunities across horticulture, dairy, and some interest coming out of viticulture as well. Partners and collaborators, as I said, we're leading. At the moment, we have confirmed partnership and either cash or in-kind investment from Telstra, DPIRD WA, the GGA, FarmLink, which is New South Wales grower group, probably one of the big three. The BCCM, we have strong interest in accessing the data from Smarter Regions CRC, the Australian Institute of Machine Learning at the University of Adelaide, the Melbourne Data Analytics Project at University of Melbourne, Centre for Digital Agriculture at Curtin University, Griffith University, Leanne Wiseman, and the Graham Centre for Agricultural Innovation at Charles Sturt University. And one of the service providers, ProAgrica. So ProAgrica basically has a series of APIs that allow us to import and export data in different forms and overlay that data so it can be used. Progress to date, quite a bit. I'll skim through that to leave time for questions, but we've developed a range of white papers into the value case. We've validated the information architecture. We're in the process of working with the Food Agility CRC on the project proposal. We're working with the Smarter Regions CRC on project proposals. We were going to put a project proposal into round 10 of the CRC and P into September of this year. Except unfortunately they decided that for the first time they were going to target the CRCPs, and it was going to be around recycling, which ruled us out straight away. So we're now hoping that round 11 and round 12 will potentially come back to a more open sense. Some of the challenges to completion we're still facing. In essence, we're building research infrastructure. None of the CRCs or RDCs actually have building research infrastructure among their guidelines. They are there to commercialise research or develop cooperative research, but building infrastructure fits somewhere else. So we're working in a number of areas to get that research infrastructure completed. As I said before, the CRCs and RDCs are very keen to get their hands on the data. Investor misunderstanding of the sector and misperceptions regarding use of data collection. I think a lot of companies out there just think that farmers are going to throw them their data on the promise that they'll do something handy and useful with it in the future. And also a bit of a misperception that they think a lot of farmers are collecting data as it is, and that data is in a usable format. That's unfortunately not the case. We as farming systems groups, so BCG, GGA, FarmLink, don't have the resources to fund anything on our own entirety. And for the private sector, even though there's value cases around the data collection and using the data, actually setting up the infrastructure to move that data around has no direct pathway to return on investment for them. So we've tried a number of pathways. We are getting closer to the funding side of things. We had a meeting with Mr. Littleproud the other day and started to talk through some of this and some of the options available to us. Had a meeting today with Agriculture Victoria and some of the options available to us, and are talking with Leanne Wiseman about the ARC pathway. So, I mean, if anyone out there is interested, we're ready to go. We've got the whole thing together. We've got the infrastructure, the mechanisms to be able to build this. We just seem to be operating in a sector where the RDC and CRCs aren't necessarily geared up to do what we're trying to do. That's me. Thank you.
It feels strange without an applause, but thank you very much, Phillip. That was really, really fascinating listening to that. I did want to open up the floor now for questions. If you have any questions, pop them in the chat and we can direct those to Chris and Phillip.
Well, while we're waiting for questions, I've got one. Have you started rolling out the digital agronomists? Did you say, Phil?
With yes and no. So yes, we're kind of doing that unofficially in the background, and we have a number of digital agronomists identified, and we're testing some of the concepts through various projects that I can't mention because some of it's happening a little bit unofficially. I think that the logic behind the digital agronomists for us is just the serious disconnect between the various partners in this space or the various organisations in the space, and it's what they're trying to do and they're trying to achieve. So there's huge value to the commercial sector in accessing that data, but in a lot of cases they don't necessarily want to pay for it. They expect that farmers will hand it to them on the understanding that there may be some value for it in the future. And as I said, just the mismatch between what they're producing and what farmers need is fairly significant. We've had interest in funding one element of this project. So we've had one of the CRCs come back and say, hey, we'd love to fund the digital agronomist and we'd love to get that up and running. My response to that is, well, it's that's great, thank you very much, but just collecting data with no understanding of how we continue to collect that data on a project-by-project basis doesn't move us forward. What it does is just create another silo of data sitting within the CRC without a clear understanding of how we collect that data on a large basis and share it. So I think there will become a point when we just say, look, we have to do that. Just to get this done, we need to break it up. We need to do it project by project. But we've still got a couple of irons in the fire before we get to that point.
Thanks, Phil. So we've got a comment, really impressed, and we will be posting a recording on our website to be followed up, so we'll let people know about that. So I've got a question. What sort of funding and runway do you have right now?
At the moment, we've got about $1.5 million in co-investment sitting there waiting. Most of that co-investment has been provided to us on the understanding that that's going to be matched from a CRC and RDC or another source. So we're working very closely with a couple of RDCs and CRCs to identify that. I'm reasonably confident that we can get over that barrier of falling between the cracks, but we just have to word it right and potentially spin the project in a different direction to get there. One of the approaches to food agility CRC is potentially we just pitch ourselves as a company that's aggregating and selling farmer data, which there are a number of out there at the moment, and they seem to be worth a fairly substantial chunk of money. That's not the intent, but if we have to go down that path and do that in the first instance to be able to get this up and running, that's one approach. And yes, sorry, just to follow up on, I'm just looking at Nathan's question, what makes a good digital agronomist, and are you looking at medical other domains? Good digital agronomist, first part of that question, obviously a very clear understanding of agronomy and how farms operate on the ground, what you need to do to grow a good crop and grow a profitable crop. Not necessarily talking about just a good yielding crop, but a profitable crop, because there is a difference. And they need an understanding of the data, how to collect the data, how to use that data. And at the moment, those people are few and far between. We do have one, Adrian Rolls, sitting on here at the moment, unless he's anticipated the question and dropped off, so I couldn't throw him anything. Fantastic. The second side of things, medical and other domains, for those that understand data dimensions, absolutely being able to allow patients or allow people to share their medical records for medical research, but have control over how that's utilised, have control over who accesses that and under what terms, is certainly something that we're considering moving into other domains. That's one of the key value cases outside of agriculture. In a previous life, I worked in the pharmaceutical space, and probably had Chris wandering around, would have spun this up in the medical space rather than the ag space in the first instance.
We've got one from Pamela from before. Do you set up groups of like cropping farmers to establish benchmarks?
Yes, I think I kind of addressed that before the presentation. But the way we see this benchmarking is absolutely key. The first side of things is around the data use, but the benchmarking comes in when as a farmer you've got your basic agronomy right, and you're looking forward to what's next. What are my constraints? What are other farmers potentially doing that's working for them? What are the other farming systems I could be looking into that fit in with my agroecological zone, with the reality on the ground, with my climate? That's where benchmarking becomes absolutely critical. Better understanding your farming operation by looking at what others are doing, and potentially looking at what they're doing differently and the results that's having. Benchmarking on its own doesn't seem to be enough of a value proposition for farmers, though, because, again, the effort to go to collect that data, to aggregate that data, to clean that data, it is immense. The project Chris referred to earlier, where Cyro came in and did some work for us, it took them 5 days per farmer to do that. So if you're looking for our project where we're looking at working with 90 farmers, 5 days each with 3 digital agronomists, you're still looking at half a year just to clean that data and make it useful and available. And farmers aren't going to pay that cost without a clear value case. So everything comes back to value case, because value case is why they collect the data in the first place. Once they're collecting it, we can discuss what we do with it.
Actually, Phil, it'll be interesting. One of our other webinars we have coming up in a few weeks' time is from a few benchmarking groups who've been benchmarking for a number of decades. So it would actually be interesting to ask them that question about how long it takes them to prepare the data for their benchmarking.
Look, it depends on whether they're using data for benchmarking, what degree of data they're using for their benchmarking. Because as I said earlier, a lot of farmers are doing this without collecting a hell of a lot of data in the first place. It's all sitting up here. They're out on the header at harvest and they're looking at their yields, and they're thinking about what they did during the year and what's happened in previous years, what the potential causes for that are, and then they get together and discuss that without ever a spreadsheet changing hands.
But Tanya, what low-hanging fruit use cases to demonstrate value to grower and the concept to the RDCs and CRCs?
I'm beginning to wish I hadn't invited Tanya to this webinar. Look, the really low-hanging value cases are the free data that farmers are already collecting. So a really good example of potential use for free data and low-hanging fruit is, instead of paying thousands of dollars per hectare to get soil testing done, Google Maps at the right time of year will give you a very clear indication of where your soil zones change and potentially where you need to be testing, and your engine load data of your tractor. So as you're pulling your seeding rig through the ground, as it's going from sandy soils to clayey soils or loamy soils, the effort, the strain on the engine goes up and down. So you print out your engine load map, you overlay that with your Google Earth reference and potentially throw an NDVI over the top of it. And you've got a fairly good data set to start making decisions from. Adrian's just sent me a text pointing out that benchmarking data is not spatial data. Thank you, Adrian.
Yeah.
So I think it's in that case, it's making use of the data that they're already collecting that they may not have been shown how to use, or the value of it is the low-hanging fruit. And it's really helping them inform the kind of PA decision-making. And again, one of the big learnings for me over the last 18 months working in this space and getting my head around PA and how it operates is precision agriculture. Value from it is not necessarily around growing more profitable crops. It's around using your resources more efficiently. It's around the potential savings in terms of your logistics. And it's around actually reducing the cost of producing that crop rather than increasing the amount of crop you're producing. So that to me is the low-hanging fruit. Tanya and I can argue over that a little bit later on.
Thanks, Bill. Got Ruth, building on your last slide, can you give a couple of examples of what you're looking for from a new potential partner?
Thumbs up from Tanya. Brilliant. Thank you. Look, I think that the co-investment around actually building and customising that data repository is our core area of challenge at the moment. So output 4 around finding partners to undertake the research or the product development, not a challenge at all. GRDC, MLA, integrity systems, food agility, CRC, smarter regions, CRC, all have expressed a great deal of excitement for what they think they can do with the data once we've got it. It's around actually getting that data, amalgamating that data and having it in a system that we can share that data repeatedly and widely. The challenges at the moment, and apart from things like NCRIS, which is specifically there to build a research infrastructure, that's the area we're struggling to find at the moment. We've got $1 million+ sitting there from Telstra on the table. We really need someone to match that, and once we've got that, we're off and running.
Rob said, thanks, Phil. Will you be developing data collection standards for farmers?
I will be working with farmers to help them collect their data. I don't think, there's already organisations out there like FedUni that are working on data standards and collection standards and usability standards. I don't think we want to add another to what's already a fairly significant and confusing pile. It's about sifting through those and identifying the right ones, the ones that work for us, the ones that work for the industry, the ones that make that data, easy to move around and don't lock it down. One of the challenges I have with data standards is the minute you decide that you're going to use a specific standard for something, you tend to strip the richness out of it. And the example I use is Esperanto. I don't know if anyone remembers Esperanto, but it was a kind of abortive attempt in the 60s, 70s and 80s to develop an international language so we can all communicate together. And it worked. You had this mishmash of pidgin and different languages that was thrown together. But the problem is there are things that you can say in French that you simply can't say in Esperanto. There are things you can say in Italian and English that you can't say in any other language. And my studies at university were in weird things like philosophy and ethics. And language is a really key part of why French philosophy is French philosophy, because you think in a particular way because of the language you're using. The minute you have that universal metadata standard, you lose the richness in the language you're working with. And what tends to happen is you develop something like Dublin Core, which is a universal metadata standard, right? And everyone starts to agree with that and says, there's things I can't do with Dublin Core, so I'm just going to adapt it slightly. And they move it and they change it and they add to it. And within 10 years, you're at the point where you've got various versions of Dublin Core and you're back in the same situation you started in the first place. So yes, not looking to recreate new standards, looking to adapt what's there and use something that's already there.
And Pamela's asked, in terms of drought resilience, what data measures are you looking at? Soil carbon, soil humus and water retention, and are these measurable with current data technologies?
Yeah, really good question. And a really cop-out answer, sorry. It depends on where you're farming. So the data you're going to be looking at in the foothills of the Snowy Mountains is going to be slightly different to what you're looking at in the very dry, low rainfall zone of the Central Valley. Obviously, water retention is a huge one in there. Data around soil types, data around soil compaction, climate data, a lot of stuff around practice data. The fact that you have farmers next door neighbours, and one farmer is much more profitable than the other, and one farmer is much more resilient than the other, kind of indicates that it's not just your physical characteristics that impact on your ability to be resilient to drought and to recover from drought. And I think that's the challenge when we're doing this stuff at the moment, is we've spent a lot of time looking at the kind of biophysical characteristics and not necessarily got our heads around the farming practice side of things and what those farmers are doing differently with what they have.
Fantastic, and a big thanks from Muriel's Bobs to both you, Phillip and Chris, for your presentations tonight. So, is there
if I can, I might just throw briefly that soil carbon question to Chris, because he's worked in that space a hell of a lot longer than I have.
I think Pamela's raised a good question. I think some of the challenges is around measurement, and as Phillip highlighted, I think in different farming systems, the measurements, what's measured, range is important. But so the drought resilience, I think this is interesting space of the soil, because I think the soil stuff is very important in the drought resilience, but it is important for that particular place of what you measure of. So a drought resilience. So I do know that if you're in 800 mil rainfall and you miss out on 50 mils of rain compared to a 300 mil rain, and you miss out on 50 mils of rain, there's a big difference there because of percentage-wise. But actually, resilience-wise, it might be that the 50 mils less in the 300 mil system may well be not as impactful because of the low input system they've designed and used to variability. So, the drought resilience in the soil is a very interesting question, and I think it's not straightforward, but I think the most important bit I think Pamela's raised is the measurability of the data. I think that's before we can even measure those things, you actually got to get the tools that can actually meaningfully measure, particularly soil carbon, because it's so stable in our generally weathered soils that are millions of years old. So the soil carbon is very hard to change in most low rainfall, medium low rainfall environments.
A really good example of how that cooperate. One of the projects we've been working on for a little while is trying to understand farming practices and understand the decisions that farmers make throughout the year. At harvest, or not at harvest, at sowing, you have a series of critical decisions and a series of inputs, data that come in that inform those decisions. You have the same throughout the growing season in terms of putting fertiliser on. How much do I put on? Am I comfortable that I'm getting enough rainfall? Am I close enough to a rainfall that it's going to wash into the soil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What really surprises me is that I don't see any research at the moment where people have actually mapped those decisions farmers are making and the inputs, the data that are inputting into those decisions. The types of sensors that we need to collect that data and how we need to feed that back to farmers to improve their decision making. What we tend to have is a whole bunch of NDVI and kind of algorithms running over those NDVI images that may or may not be ground truthed, spitting out results of really varying quality. So again, understanding those decisions, understanding what farmers are doing, why they're doing them, will then tell us what data we need to be collecting, whether it's soil carbon or, as to Pamela's question, whether it's humus, water retention or whatever. I just think at the moment we're collecting a lot of data without really clearly understanding why we're collecting it. And then that's leading to a lot of waste, a lot of duplicated effort. Look, it may be leading to a lot of research publications and people getting tenure within universities, but it's the practical outputs on the ground that we're keen to see more of.
I think that's probably a great way to finish off the discussion. There's almost a few more questions. There's a lot more questions hanging over where to from here. I just really want to say I find it really interesting that the two fundamental issues that I know Chris spoke of in the really early days about value and trust are still some of the biggest challenges, issues that are faced in moving forward in this data cooperative space. But I think it sounds like there's so much amazing work that's being done, Phil. So congratulations to you with these big leaps forward, and we really look forward to staying in touch and hearing about the progress. And
thank you.
If there is anyone out there that sees opportunities to connect, we can provide those details for Phil and Chris, and we'd be also happy to help facilitate any of those introductions and connections.
Lovely, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, so thank you, and thanks for all the great questions from our audience too for our first webinar. I think you've been a fantastic interactive audience, so thank you very much. But next week, same time, same place, we have another collaborative solutions webinar topic, which is about out-of-the-box solutions. So these are about two amazing women in agriculture who've come up with two different ways to connect community directly with the growers and producers in their region through out-of-the-box food delivery and through an innovative market concept. So we'd love you to join us if you enjoyed this week. We'd love you to join us next week, same time, same place. Once again, thanks to Phil and Chris for such a fascinating discussion, and we hope to all see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.